Hello and welcome to the London Legal Podcast, presented by Hodge, Jones and Allen Solicitors.
Hello, I'm Lorna Webster and I'm here today with Isobel Lovett. We're both partners within the specialist asbestos disease team here at Hodge, Jones and Allen, and between us we have many decades of experience in handling asbestos disease cases. Today we're going to be exploring some of the myths surrounding asbestos. We hope you find this informative. Isobel, we both know that asbestos is a mineral that when disturbed releases microscopic fibres that can be inhaled and can cause permanent damage to the lungs and lead to serious health conditions. Since around the turn of the 19th century, it's been known that asbestos is dangerous for health, and this led to the introduction of legal regulations in the UK from the 1930s onwards, which were aimed at protecting workers. However, many employers failed to prioritise the safety of their employees, leaving those workers vulnerable to the harmful effects of inhaling asbestos fibres.
Yes, Lorna, anybody who's been exposed to asbestos fibres has a lifetime risk of developing devastating illnesses such as mesothelioma, lung cancer, asbestosis and pleural thickening. Even though the dangers have been known for over a century, people are still being exposed to asbestos fibres today. Although asbestos has been banned in more than 60 countries, it's still the number one cause of work-related deaths in the world.
Isobel, there are lots of myths around asbestos, aren't there? Should we explore some of those today?
Yeah.
One of those myths is that asbestos exposure is safe in small doses. What's your view on this?
This is a complete nonsense. There's no known safe level of exposure to asbestos dust, and any exposure, however small, could be harmful to health.
Another myth is that I've had many clients over the years tell me they were only exposed to white asbestos and therefore this isn't a problem at all for their health because white asbestos is safe. What would you say about this?
This again is a falsehood, and it was promoted by the asbestos industry to maintain sales of their products. Although blue and brown asbestos are considered to be more toxic, white asbestos cannot be considered to be safe. All types of asbestos dust are capable of causing asbestos diseases, including mesothelioma, which at the present time is an incurable cancer. For the last few years, about 2,500 people have been newly diagnosed with mesothelioma in the UK each year. I'd urge anyone who's been diagnosed with an asbestos disease to seek expert legal advice, irrelevant to the source of their exposure.
Isobel, some people will come to us and they won't know where they've come into contact with asbestos dust. Maybe you could explain some of the avenues that we look into to try and help them.
So it's not unusual following a diagnosis of mesothelioma, or indeed any other asbestos-related condition, for clients to be initially uncertain as to where they were exposed to the asbestos dust, particularly when they've never worked with asbestos materials directly. And this is why it's so important that anyone who's been diagnosed with an asbestos-related illness to seek legal advice from a firm that really specialise in asbestos-related cases.
Isobel, maybe you could tell us some of the sources of exposure that we investigate.
Yeah, there are many different potential sources of asbestos exposure, and it's our job obviously to investigate and establish where the exposure took place. So our first line of inquiry is usually to examine the client's own work history. In addition, we'll consider a family member's work history, as asbestos dust may have been brought home on contaminated clothing. There's also the possibility that exposure may have taken place from spending time in buildings, perhaps undergoing renovation, or even the client having lived near to an asbestos factory. We'll also investigate whether exposure could have taken place from using an asbestos-contaminated product such as talcum powder or powdered makeup.
Isobel, if I could just pick up on two sources of exposure you mentioned there, in relation to being exposed to asbestos dust through contaminated clothing of a family member and talcum powder or makeup products. Can people who have been diagnosed with mesothelioma still bring compensation claims for those sorts of exposure?
Yes, it's possible still to bring compensation claims for these sorts of exposure. However, the law is rather unfair in that claims can only be brought for secondary exposure, which occurred after 1965. We believe that this is discriminatory and manifestly unfair, as it tends to mainly adversely affect women, and we've therefore set up a petition to try and change the law in this area. In relation to talcum powder and makeup exposure, we've become aware of this in recent years, and we've assisted now many clients who've developed mesothelioma to recover compensation.
I must say, Isobel, it's really quite scary to hear all of this, especially as talcum powder has been so commonly used by the public across all age groups. This is something we are currently campaigning about to raise awareness for the general public. We will be bringing further updates in future podcasts about developments around this area, so please do join us. In the meantime, Isobel, what steps would you advise people take to protect themselves from being exposed to asbestos dust?
Well, despite the new use of asbestos being banned in 1999 in the UK, unfortunately, because asbestos was so widely used, particularly in the construction industry from the 1950s onwards, it's estimated that asbestos is still present in many buildings, both publicly and privately owned, which are in use today. Construction workers and tradesmen are particularly at risk, and so should consciously check for the presence of asbestos materials before they start work in any building. Owners of buildings to which the public has access are obliged to maintain an asbestos register, and so anyone carrying out work in these buildings should ask to see that register before undertaking work. And many rented homes still contain asbestos materials, and so tenants should speak to their landlord if they have any concerns about asbestos in their home. For people who own their own homes, which were built before the year 2000, they should be aware that asbestos materials may have been used in construction, and so are advised to commission an asbestos survey before any major DIY or renovations are carried out at home. If asbestos is found to be present, it should be removed by a specialist licensed asbestos removal contractor before the work is undertaken. And in respect of any asbestos fibres in beauty products, my advice is simply to avoid any powder-based product and instead use cream-based products wherever possible. Ideally, look out for products which are labelled as being talc-free. Fortunately, there are plenty of these talc-free products available on the market across all price ranges.
Isobel, if someone has been diagnosed with an asbestos-related condition, what legal avenues are open to them?
Well, if you've developed an asbestos-related illness, you may be entitled to bring a claim for compensation against your former employer or against whoever caused you to be exposed to asbestos dust. You can also be entitled to claim some state benefits. And we'll explore all possible avenues with you and advise you on what we consider the best options are for you. In addition to obtaining compensation for any pain and suffering which the illness can cause, a successful claim can also include the costs of care, private medical treatment, loss of any income, and any other financial losses and expenses which have been caused by the illness. I'd like to reassure people listening, though, that not everyone who has been exposed to asbestos fibres will go on to develop an asbestos-related illness. But for those who have been exposed to asbestos dust, it is important to be aware of the risks and to seek medical advice if you have any concerns about unexplained symptoms such as a persistent cough or breathlessness.
Thank you, Isobel, for exposing the myths surrounding asbestos and shedding light on its danger to health. It serves as a useful reminder that even though progress has been made in relation to raising awareness about the dangers of asbestos, it continues to be a present hazard that we all need to be aware of. This concludes today's episode on myths surrounding asbestos. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to bringing you more insightful discussions in the future here on London Legal Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the London Legal Podcast, presented to you by Hodge, Jones and Allen Solicitors. To listen to more podcasts, follow us on SoundCloud or visit our website www.hja.net for interesting opinions and the latest legal information. Or if you need our help, call 0808 2780 216.